The fluorescent light in the Williams kitchen buzzed like an insect trapped behind glass. It was evening, and the heat from the day still clung to the walls of the apartment. The smell of detergent drifted from the laundry basket by the door, evidence that Darius's mother had come home from her second shift and gone straight to washing uniforms for her next one. On the table lay a handful of coins and a crumpled dollar bill. Darius counted them twice, his lips moving silently. $4.32. That was all they had left until Friday's paycheck. From the couch, 10-year-old Lila peeked over a torn comic book. "We can still get chicken nuggets, right?" she asked hopefully. Darius forced a smile. "Maybe not tonight, Lil. Mom's tired. We'll make noodles instead." He pocketed the coins, telling himself it wasn't pity, it was duty. Their mother, exhausted beyond words, had fallen asleep sitting upright, her fingers still curled around the TV remote. He slipped on his worn sneakers and stepped outside into the rust-colored dusk of Carterville. Streetlights flickered over cracked pavement. Every other building had a "for sale" or "condemned" sign. The grocery store had shut down months ago, its windows now plastered with glossy ads for Hale Industries luxury residences, opening 2026. Darius's mother called it progress. Darius called it a ghost town wearing new clothes. He crossed the street toward the corner market. The owner, Mr. Patel, gave him a nod from behind the counter. "Evening, Darius." "Just." The fluorescent light in the Williams kitchen buzzed like an insect trapped behind glass. It was evening, and the heat from the day still clung to the walls of the apartment. The smell of detergent drifted from the laundry basket by the door, evidence that Darius's mother had come home from her second shift and gone straight to washing uniforms for her next one. On the table lay a handful of coins and a crumpled dollar bill. Darius counted them twice, his lips moving silently. $4.32. That was all they had left until Friday's paycheck. From the couch, 10-year-old Lila peeked over a torn comic book. "We can still get chicken nuggets, right?" she asked hopefully. Darius forced a smile. "Maybe not tonight, Lil. Mom's tired. We'll make noodles instead." He pocketed the coins, telling himself it wasn't pity, it was duty. Their mother, exhausted beyond words, had fallen asleep sitting upright, her fingers still curled around the TV remote. He slipped on his worn sneakers and stepped outside into the rust-colored dusk of Carterville. Streetlights flickered over cracked pavement. Every other building had a "for sale" or "condemned" sign. The grocery store had shut down months ago, its windows now plastered with glossy ads for Hale Industries luxury residences, opening 2026. Darius's mother called it progress. Darius called it a ghost town wearing new clothes. He crossed the street toward the corner market. The owner, Mr. Patel, gave him a nod from behind the counter. "Evening, Darius." "Just." "Noodles again?" "Yeah. And maybe a can of tomatoes if it fits." Mr. Patel's eyes flicked to the coins in Darius's palm, then away. "Take them both. Pay me next time." Darius hesitated. Pride was one of the few things left that still worked properly in the Williams household. "I'll pay," he said quietly, sliding every coin across the counter. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, a sound caught his ear, soft voices near the pharmacy 2 doors down. An elderly man and woman stood there, framed by the harsh neon sign. The man's hands shook as he opened his wallet, counting bills with trembling fingers. The woman, her hair pinned neatly despite the humidity, held a small white prescription bag. "I told you, Frank," she whispered, "we can't afford it." The pharmacist's voice was apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison. The insurance didn't approve it. Without the full payment, I can't release it." Frank Morrison's shoulders sagged. "Please. It's heart medicine. She needs it tonight." The pharmacist looked helpless. "Then you'll need $45.75. $45 might as well have been 45,000. Darius knew that tone, the slow collapse of hope disguised as adult patience. He looked down at the plastic bag in his own hand, 2 packs of noodles and a can of tomatoes. Dinner for 3. He thought of his mother's cracked hands, his sister's hungry smile. But then his eyes met Evelyn Morrison's. She clutched her chest lightly, as though trying to keep her heart inside her body. Darius walked forward before he could think twice. "Excuse me," he said to the pharmacist, his voice small but steady. "How much do they still need?" The man blinked. $45.75. Darius reached into his pocket. The coins jingled like tiny bells of defiance. He set them on the counter, quarters, dimes, pennies, and 1 limp dollar bill. "Here's $4.32. The room went silent. The pharmacist stared. Evelyn Morrison covered her mouth. Frank Morrison's eyes filled with wet astonishment. "Son," Frank whispered, "you can't." "It's okay," Darius said, avoiding everyone's gaze. "You need it more." He turned to leave, embarrassed by how light his pockets felt. The door's bell jingled behind him, and he stepped into the cool night air, his stomach tight with hunger and something else he couldn't name. "Wait!" Evelyn called. She hurried after him, breathless. "What's your name?" "Darius." She pressed his hand between both of hers, paper-thin skin trembling. "You've done more for us than you know." He smiled faintly. "It's just money, ma'am." "No," she said, her eyes bright. "It's kindness." When Darius returned home, his mother was awake, folding laundry. "Took you long enough," she said, without looking up. "Where's the change?" He set the grocery bag down, shame burning his throat. "I helped somebody." Her hands froze mid-fold. "With what?" "Medicine." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fan. Then she sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Darius, baby, we don't have money to be saving the world." "I know, Mom," he said softly. "But maybe the world needed a little help tonight." She didn't reply, but later, when she served the noodles thinned with extra water, she put the larger portion in his bowl. Across town, in a dimly lit study lined with leather books, Richard Hale, founder of the same Hale Industries that had gutted Carterville, read an email from a retirement home. It was from Frank Morrison, a name he hadn't seen in years. His father. "Richard," the message began, "I know you don't like hearing from me. But something happened tonight. A boy, black, maybe 15, gave me and Evelyn his last $4 so she could get her medicine. His name was Darius Williams. I thought you should know there are still good people in the world, even if money makes the rest of us forget." Richard closed his laptop slowly, staring at his reflection in the darkened screen. The name Darius Williams echoed in his mind like a moral debt. Back in Carterville, Darius lay awake beside his sister, counting cracks on the ceiling. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly on the tin roof. He didn't regret what he'd done, but hunger gnawed at him. Lila's sleepy voice broke the quiet. "You'll be famous one day, Darius. People will know you're good." He smiled in the dark. Nah. I just want everyone to be okay. As thunder rolled over the broken skyline, the boy with nothing but $4.32 drifted to sleep, unaware that his small act of compassion had just set a millionaire's conscience in motion, and that in 3 days, a black town car would stop outside his door, carrying the beginning of a fight that would test the worth of kindness itself. Morning light crept through the cracks of the blinds, painting faint gold lines across the worn carpet of the Williams living room. The world outside was already awake, the clang of garbage trucks, the rumble of buses carrying factory workers, the chatter of early commuters, but inside, the air still felt suspended, heavy with the quiet pride of what Darius had done the night before. His mother, Elaine Williams, sat at the kitchen table, elbows propped against yesterday's newspaper. Her eyes traced the bold headline, "Hale Industries expands downtown project," before drifting toward her son, who was tying his sneakers. The headline didn't say what the expansion meant: more evictions, more boarded-up stores, more families like theirs pushed further to the edge of the map. She watched him silently for a moment, then said, "People at church were talking about a boy who helped an old couple at the pharmacy last night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Darius froze mid-knot, cheeks flushing. "Maybe." Elaine smiled faintly. "Maybe you did something right, even if it wasn't smart." She reached across the table and placed a small brown paper bag in his hand. Inside were 2 jelly sandwiches and an apple. "Eat at school, okay? Don't skip lunch again." He nodded, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "Thanks, Mom." When he stepped outside, the neighborhood greeted him like an old friend, broken but alive. Mr. Harris from apartment 3B was sweeping his stoop, humming off-key. A group of kids played basketball with a half-flat ball near the corner. Despite everything, Carterville still breathed, still tried. At school, whispers followed him. "That's him, the kid who gave up his dinner money. For dollars and something, right? Man, my mom said she cried when she heard." Darius ducked his head, embarrassed. He hadn't told anyone, but it seemed kindness traveled faster than secrets. In homeroom, his teacher, Ms. Garrett, called him up quietly. "Darius, A." Morning light crept through the cracks of the blinds, painting faint gold lines across the worn carpet of the Williams living room. The world outside was already awake, the clang of garbage trucks, the rumble of buses carrying factory workers, the chatter of early commuters, but inside, the air still felt suspended, heavy with the quiet pride of what Darius had done the night before. His mother, Elaine Williams, sat at the kitchen table, elbows propped against yesterday's newspaper. Her eyes traced the bold headline, "Hale Industries expands downtown project," before drifting toward her son, who was tying his sneakers. The headline didn't say what the expansion meant: more evictions, more boarded-up stores, more families like theirs pushed further to the edge of the map. She watched him silently for a moment, then said, "People at church were talking about a boy who helped an old couple at the pharmacy last night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Darius froze mid-knot, cheeks flushing. "Maybe." Elaine smiled faintly. "Maybe you did something right, even if it wasn't smart." She reached across the table and placed a small brown paper bag in his hand. Inside were 2 jelly sandwiches and an apple. "Eat at school, okay? Don't skip lunch again." He nodded, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "Thanks, Mom." When he stepped outside, the neighborhood greeted him like an old friend, broken but alive. Mr. Harris from apartment 3B was sweeping his stoop, humming off-key. A group of kids played basketball with a half-flat ball near the corner. Despite everything, Carterville still breathed, still tried. At school, whispers followed him. That's him, the kid who gave up his dinner money. For dollars and something, right? Man, my mom said she cried when she heard. Darius ducked his head, embarrassed. He hadn't told anyone, but it seemed kindness traveled faster than secrets. In homeroom, his teacher, Ms. Garrett, called him up quietly. Darius, a reporter called this morning asking for you. I told them we don't give out student information, but, did something happen? He shrugged. Just helped someone, I guess. Her expression softened. Sometimes the smallest things make the loudest echoes. That same morning, across town, Richard Hale stood by the window of his office on the 30th floor of Hale Industries. The skyline glittered, glass towers reflecting the sun, cranes slicing the air like silver spears. He'd built this empire from nothing after cutting ties with his father. He didn't believe in sentiment, only results. Yet his father's email kept flashing in his mind. A boy gave us his last $4. He tried to ignore it, diving into meetings and contracts, but every time he looked down at the city below, the city his company had renewed, he saw boarded windows and abandoned parks. The world was clean on paper, filthy in truth. Sir, his assistant, Clara, interrupted. The investors are waiting for you. Richard turned, adjusting his cufflinks. Reschedule them. Reschedule? They've flown in from tomorrow. Tell them something came up. He didn't know what he was doing exactly, only that for the first time in years, he wanted to see something honest. He typed, Carterville Pharmacy, into his tablet, then, Darius Williams. The search results surprised him. Local posts, community forums, even a picture of the old Morrison couple smiling weakly in front of the clinic. Someone had captioned it, "A boy's kindness kept love alive." Richard closed the device and stared at his reflection. He looked polished, successful, and completely hollow. Meanwhile, Frank and Evelyn Morrison sat in their small apartment, sunlight spilling across the breakfast table. The medicine bottle gleamed beside the salt shaker. Frank, Evelyn murmured, you think that boy's all right? He gave us everything. Her husband smiled, his wrinkled hand covering hers. He will be. People like that don't go unnoticed. He reached for his pen and paper, the same way he had when he wrote to his estranged son years ago. This time, his words came easily. Richard. I know you don't want to hear from me. But an angel found me yesterday. A boy named Darius Williams gave me the last of his money for your stepmother's medicine. He didn't know who I was, didn't ask for anything. I thought you should know there are still people doing right, even when they have nothing to gain. I can't stop thinking, if a child can act with such decency, what are we grown men doing with our wealth and power? Your father, Frank. He sealed the envelope, unsure if it would even reach the man he'd raised. Still, he felt lighter, as though he'd passed something sacred forward. By sunset, the story had spread beyond Carterville. A local journalist, Sabrina Cross, shared a post. 15-year-old Darius Williams gave his last $4.32 so an elderly couple could buy heart medicine. In a world obsessed with profit, this act of kindness reminds us what humanity looks like. Within hours, the post had thousands of shares. People called Darius, the boy with the $4. Someone started a donation drive for the family. Others debated whether the story was even real, because such selflessness, they said, couldn't exist anymore. At home, Darius sat on the floor helping Lila with her homework when their old flip phone buzzed non-stop with calls and messages. His mother looked at the screen, bewildered. "Why are strangers asking about you?" "I don't know," Darius said honestly. He felt exposed, like the world had turned a private moment into a spectacle. The next morning, Richard Hale woke before dawn. His father's letter sat open on his desk. He'd read it twice already, but this time, something shifted. He opened his laptop and searched again. There it was, the same post, the same picture, the same boy. He leaned back, his throat tightening. Darius Williams. For years, Richard had ignored the human cost of his projects. Numbers and charts made sense, people didn't. Yet now, this boy's face haunted him. He picked up his phone. "Clara, cancel tomorrow's board trip. Find me a driver. We're going to Carterville." "Carterville, sir." "Yes," he said, his tone sharper than intended. "I need to see where my father almost died, and where a boy reminded him how to live." In the Williams apartment, breakfast was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge. Elaine looked out the window and said, "Feels like something's coming." Darius laughed. "What, a storm?" She shook her head slowly. "No, baby. Something bigger." She didn't know how right she was. Because at that very moment, down the highway, a black town car was cutting through the morning fog, headed straight for Carterville. Inside sat a man whose heart, for the first time in decades, was starting to remember how to feel. And for Darius Williams, the boy who had given away his last $4.32, life was about to change in ways that would test the strength of everything he believed about kindness, justice, and the price of compassion. Carterville's streets had never seen a vehicle like that before. Sleek, glossy, and silent, the black town car rolled through the cracked roads like a shark gliding through shallow water. The morning sun reflected off its polished hood, casting fleeting flashes across faded murals and sagging porches. Every head turned as it passed, the kind of attention reserved for things that didn't belong there. Darius was sitting on the curb outside the corner market, helping Mr. Patel unpack boxes of instant noodles. His old bike leaned nearby, chain rusted, seat taped together. It was a slow Saturday, the kind of day that carried no promise except heat and dust. Then, a whisper started spreading along the block, "There's a fancy car coming down Maple." By the time it stopped in front of Darius's building, a small crowd had gathered. Curtains fluttered. Neighbors leaned over balconies, squinting into the sun. The driver stepped out first, tall and crisp in a dark suit, his movements exact, practiced. Then the rear door opened, and out came Richard Hale, gray suit, silver tie, posture straight as a blade. Even in the uneven light of Carterville's morning, his presence seemed to bend the air. Darius straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. Richard's eyes softened as he looked at the boy, young, lean, eyes steady with the kind of humility he'd forgotten existed. "You're Darius Williams?" "Yes, sir. My name is Richard Hale." The name meant little to Darius, but the murmurs in the crowd said otherwise. "I believe you helped my father and stepmother a few days ago." Recognition flickered in Darius's eyes. "Mr. Morrison. He's your dad." Richard nodded once. "He is. And he told me what you did." He gestured to his driver, who retrieved a small white envelope from the car. "I came to thank you in person." Darius took a step back. "You didn't have to do that, sir." "I did," Richard replied evenly. "Not many people would give away their last dollar for someone else." The envelope caught the sunlight, thick, heavy, obviously containing money. Richard extended it. Darius didn't move. Around them, whispers stirred like wind in dry leaves. His mother appeared at the doorway, apron still on. "Darius, what's going on?" Darius looked from her to Richard, his throat tight. "He's offering us money, Mom." "For what I did?" Elaine froze, her tired eyes instantly wary. "We don't take charity." "This isn't charity," Richard said quickly. "It's gratitude." Elaine folded her arms. "Gratitude doesn't come in envelopes, Mr. Hale." The millionaire hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged, not by anyone, least of all by a woman whose shoes looked like they'd walked miles of struggle. "Please," he said, his voice softening. "You have no idea how much that moment meant. My father could have died that night." Darius looked down at his hands. His nails still bore dust from helping patch up the church fence that morning. "Sir, I didn't do it for thanks. I just couldn't walk away." The crowd had grown now, a ring of quiet witnesses, neighbors who knew too well how rare it was for power to visit their doorstep. A young mother whispered to her friend, "That's the man who owns all those new condos." "Yeah," another replied. "And that's the boy they'll never forget." Richard exhaled, realizing he wasn't just speaking to a boy anymore. He was speaking to a community. "Darius," he said finally, "if you won't take this for yourself, take it for your mother, or for your future." But Darius shook his head slowly. "My future doesn't need cash, sir. It needs chances." The word struck Richard harder than he expected. He closed the envelope, nodding slightly, humbled. "Then maybe I can help with that." Inside the Williams living room, the air was thick with the smell of old carpet and boiled coffee. Richard stood awkwardly by the door while Elaine sat across from him, posture firm, protective. Darius lingered nearby, unsure if he'd done something wrong. "I didn't come here to offend you," Richard said quietly. "I just wanted to meet the boy who reminded my father that goodness still exists." Elaine's voice softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "People around here don't have much, Mr. Hale. But what we do have, we earn. My son didn't give those $4 to make news. He did it because he's his father's child. The man who taught him to be kind died fixing someone else's car for free." Richard swallowed, feeling the weight of that truth. "Then your husband sounds like someone my father would have admired." For the first time, Elaine smiled faintly. He didn't have much to his name, but he had peace. Silence filled the room. Through the thin walls, the faint laughter of neighborhood kids echoed like music from another life. Finally, Richard said, "I'd like to help your son find a scholarship. Something honest. No publicity, no headlines." Elaine studied him, unsure if it was guilt or sincerity that drove him. "You'd really do that?" "I would," he said simply. "Because what he did, reminded me of who I used to be." Darius shifted in his seat. "I don't want to be a project, sir. I just want things to be fair, for everyone." Richard's gaze lingered on him. "Then maybe you and I want the same thing." By evening, the town car was gone, leaving behind a wake of questions and murmurs. Kids reenacted the scene on the sidewalks. Adults debated whether it would change anything. Inside their apartment, Darius sat by the window, watching the headlights fade into the horizon. "Mom," he said quietly, "you think he meant it? About helping?" Elaine folded the last of the laundry, setting it aside. "Men like that live in glass towers, baby. Sometimes they look down and see what's broken, but that doesn't mean they'll fix it." Darius nodded, but something inside him didn't agree. He looked like he wanted to try. "Hope's a good thing," she said, switching off the lamp. "Just don't let it fool you." Across town, Richard Hale sat alone in his penthouse office, the city glittering beneath him like spilled jewels. He held the unopened envelope in his hands, the same one the boy had refused. For years, he'd measured life in profit and losses, but now he couldn't stop thinking about a pair of tired eyes and a boy's steady voice saying, "My future needs chances." He placed the envelope in a drawer and whispered to himself, "Then let's see what a chance can do." The next morning, Carterville woke to a different kind of rumor. A construction foreman reported that one of Hale Industries' demolition projects, the old community center, had been ordered to pause. No one knew why. But some said a man in a gray suit had been there at dawn, standing silently in the rubble. And in the Williams apartment, Darius found a small envelope under their door. Inside was no money, no check, only a card. "Meet me at the community center tomorrow. Bring whoever you trust. Signed simply, R.H." As Darius stared at the card, the morning light broke through the window, glinting off the embossed initials. Something had shifted. The boy with the $4 had unknowingly opened a door that even the rich had forgotten existed, the door to redemption. And somewhere in that widening space between guilt and grace, a battle for the soul of a community was just beginning. The next morning, Carterville woke under a restless sky. Low clouds hung heavy, like a lid over the town, pressing down on its cracked streets and weary souls. The rumor had already spread from corner to corner. Something big was happening at the old Morrison Community Center, the same place Hale Industries had scheduled for demolition. Darius walked there with his mother beside him, the mysterious card from RH clutched tightly in his hand. The wind carried the smell of rain and dust, stirring the loose flyers that clung to lamp posts. Youth tutoring cancelled. Area unsafe. The community center stood at the end of Oak Street, a gray skeleton of its former self. The windows were boarded, the basketball hoop bent. But today, instead of bulldozers, there was a black town car parked out front, and a line of construction workers standing uncertainly, waiting for instructions. Richard Hale stood on the cracked front steps, suit immaculate despite the grit. When he saw Darius, his face softened, though his posture remained firm. "You came," he said. Darius nodded. "You asked me to." Elaine crossed her arms, keeping her tone guarded. "And what exactly do you want with my son, Mr. Hale?" Richard motioned toward the building. "To give him a voice." The phrase landed oddly in the silence. Behind them, curious neighbors had gathered, faces half hopeful, half skeptical. Richard raised his voice just enough to carry. "This center was meant to be torn down today. But after meeting Darius, I realized something. Every time we destroy a place like this, we destroy the heartbeat of a neighborhood. So I've ordered the demolition to stop." Gasps rippled through the crowd. One man shouted, "You mean you're actually listening to us now?" Richard looked at him squarely. "For once, yes." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "And what's the catch? Men like you don't give up profit for charity." The next morning, Carterville woke under a restless sky. Low clouds hung heavy, like a lid over the town, pressing down on its cracked streets and weary souls. The rumor had already spread from corner to corner. Something big was happening at the old Morrison Community Center, the same place Hale Industries had scheduled for demolition. Darius walked there with his mother beside him, the mysterious card from RH clutched tightly in his hand. The wind carried the smell of rain and dust, stirring the loose flyers that clung to lamp posts. Youth tutoring cancelled. Area unsafe. The community center stood at the end of Oak Street, a gray skeleton of its former self. The windows were boarded, the basketball hoop bent. But today, instead of bulldozers, there was a black town car parked out front, and a line of construction workers standing uncertainly, waiting for instructions. Richard Hale stood on the cracked front steps, suit immaculate despite the grit. When he saw Darius, his face softened, though his posture remained firm. "You came," he said. Darius nodded. "You asked me to." Elaine crossed her arms, keeping her tone guarded. "And what exactly do you want with my son, Mr. Hale?" Richard motioned toward the building. "To give him a voice." The phrase landed oddly in the silence. Behind them, curious neighbors had gathered, faces half hopeful, half skeptical. Richard raised his voice just enough to carry. "This center was meant to be torn down today. But after meeting Darius, I realized something. Every time we destroy a place like this, we destroy the heartbeat of a neighborhood. So I've ordered the demolition to stop." Gasps rippled through the crowd. One man shouted, "You mean you're actually listening to us now?" Richard looked at him squarely. "For once, yes." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "And what's the catch? Men like you don't give up profit for charity." Richard hesitated. "You're right. I've spent years believing progress meant erasing what was already here. But your son reminded me there's another kind of wealth, the kind you can't measure in stock prices." His sincerity was real, but the moment he finished speaking, the sound of a car door slamming broke through the air. A new figure approached, sharp suit, gold watch, flanked by two men with clipboards. Douglas Reed, the vice president of Hale Industries, and the embodiment of everything Richard was trying to leave behind. "Richard," Reed said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "The board's been calling all morning. Care to explain why you've stopped a multi-million-dollar project without clearance?" Richard straightened. "Because it's the right thing to do." "The right thing?" Reed laughed. "Since when does Hale Industries trade in sentiment? These people," he waved at the crowd, "had decades to fix this dump. Now we're supposed to hand it back to them because some kid gave away his lunch money." The insult landed like a slap. Darius felt every pair of eyes turn toward him. He stood frozen for a moment, then stepped forward. "I didn't ask anyone to stop anything," he said quietly. "But you shouldn't destroy what you didn't build." The words hung in the air like a dare. Reed sneered. "And what do you know about building, boy?" Darius met his gaze steadily. "Enough to know that when you tear down people's homes, you don't just move bricks, you move hearts. And some never find their way back." For a brief second, even Reed looked unsettled. The crowd began to murmur approval, soft but growing. Richard turned to his vice president. "This center stays. Effective immediately. We'll renovate it, fund programs, reopen classes. You can inform the board." Reed's jaw tightened. "You'll bankrupt yourself trying to please people who'll never forgive you." Richard's voice hardened. "Then maybe I'll earn something better than forgiveness." Reed stepped closer, lowering his tone. "You're throwing away years of work for a publicity stunt." Richard leaned in, whispering back, "No. I'm saving what's left of my soul." That night, the community gathered inside the old center for the first time in years. The walls still smelled of dust, the floorboards creaked, but laughter filled the air like music. Children traced chalk drawings where the basketball lines had once been. Volunteers swept, hammered, painted. Elaine ladled soup into paper bowls while Darius helped fix broken benches. For a moment, it felt like hope had weighed again, something you could hold, touch, and build with. Reporters arrived, drawn by the strange alliance between a poor teenager and a powerful CEO. Cameras flashed as Richard and Darius stood side by side beneath the flickering sign that still read Morrison Center. "Mr. Hale," a reporter shouted. "Are you doing this to repair your company's image?" Richard's answer was steady. "I'm doing it because a 15-year-old reminded me what leadership should mean, responsibility, not control." Another reporter called out, "Darius, how does it feel knowing you've changed a millionaire's mind?" Darius looked uncomfortable, then smiled faintly. "I didn't change him. I just reminded him we're still here." Applause filled the room. Even Elaine, who had spent the last 24 hours guarding her heart, felt her throat tighten. But outside, under the darkening sky, Douglas Reed stood by his car, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes," he whispered to the unseen voice on the other end. "He's losing it. The board won't let him throw money into that slum. We'll override him before week's end." Lightning flashed in the distance, silent but sharp. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Richard remained alone in the half-lit hall. Dust motes drifted through the air, illuminated by the last glow of a dying bulb. He walked to a faded mural painted decades ago, a child reaching toward the sun, and traced the outline with his finger. Behind him, the door creaked. Darius stood there, holding 2 cans of paint. "You missed a spot," he said with a grin. Richard smiled faintly. "You really believe this place can live again?" "Yes, sir," Darius said. "But not because of paint or bricks. Because people need to believe something good can still start here." Richard looked at the boy for a long moment. "Then we'll start with that." At home that night, Elaine found her son sketching on a piece of scrap cardboard, a design for a sign that read "Rebuild Carterville." She sat beside him, her voice low. "You think this man's for real?" Darius nodded. "He could have stayed in his tower. But he came here instead." She touched his shoulder. "Then be careful, baby. Sometimes the rich like to visit goodness, but they never stay long." He smiled. "Maybe this one will." In the penthouse across the city, Richard Hale stared out over the glittering skyline. His phone buzzed with messages, board members, investors, lawyers. But his mind was miles away, in a dusty community hall where laughter had replaced silence. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing profit. He was chasing peace. Yet he knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Because the more light Carterville found, the more shadow his world would try to cast over it. And as the rain began to fall outside, he whispered to himself, "Let them fight me. This time, they'll lose." By Monday morning, the war for Carterville had begun. Not with weapons or protests, but with suits, contracts, and whispered phone calls echoing from glass towers miles away. Hale Industries, once a monolith of silence and profit, was rumbling with internal unrest. Board members who'd once worshipped Richard Hale's decisiveness now muttered about his emotional decline. Richard stood in the elevator of his corporate headquarters, tie slightly loosened, briefcase in hand. He watched his reflection in the polished steel, same expensive suit, same sharp eyes, but something beneath had changed. Where certainty once lived, there was now conscience. And conscience, he was learning, was terrible for business. The doors slid open to a waiting storm. Inside the boardroom sat 12 men and women, each representing millions of dollars in investments, and none of them happy. At the head of the table was Douglas Reed, his smile sharp as glass. "Morning, Richard," Reed began smoothly. "We've been reviewing your community initiative." Richard placed his briefcase on the table. "Good. Then you already know why I'm here." Reed's voice dripped with sarcasm. "To explain why you've halted a project valued at $75 million. "No," Richard replied calmly. "To remind this company what its name used to mean." The room murmured. Reed leaned back, mock amusement in his eyes. "Enlighten us, then." Richard pressed his palms flat on the table. "Hale Industries was founded to build lives, not just structures. My father believed in community. We've strayed so far from that vision that a 15-year-old boy had to remind us of it." Reed smirked. "Ah yes, the boy with the $4. Lovely story. Viral for all the wrong reasons." He turned to the board. "Gentlemen, our stock dropped 2 points last week because of this sentimentality parade. Investors don't want emotion, they want return." A woman from finance added, "Public sympathy doesn't pay dividends." Richard straightened. "Neither does greed, once the public sees what it costs." The words landed hard. Silence filled the air. Reed's grin faltered. "You're gambling your legacy on a ghost town. What's next? You'll hand out scholarships in every slum." "If it means restoring the damage we've done," Richard said quietly, "then yes." Reed slammed a folder onto the table. "You've lost perspective." "No," Richard said, voice cutting through the tension like glass. "I've finally found it." He gathered his papers and left the room. Behind him, the whispers began anew, half fear, half admiration. The war lines were drawn, profit versus principle. Back in Carterville, the air felt electric. The Morrison Center buzzed with energy, volunteers painting walls, children laughing, and the faint hum of power tools echoing down the block. The community had taken Richard's pledge seriously. Darius, with his sleeves rolled up and paint in his hair, worked side by side with neighbors who'd once stopped believing in miracles. Mr. Patel from the market brought crates of water. Ms. Garrett, Darius's teacher, organized tutoring spaces. Even old Frank and Evelyn Morrison showed up, smiling as they watched the center come back to life. "You started all this, young man," Frank said, leaning on his cane. "Funny how $4 can shake a whole city." Darius grinned. "Guess it wasn't about the money after all." But there were signs of trouble. Flyers began appearing on telephone poles: illegal construction, Hale Industries violation. Men in suits came snooping, snapping photos. Someone slashed the tires on the volunteer van. Fear crept through Carterville's optimism like a cold draft under a door. Elaine noticed it first. "They're not gonna let this stand, baby," she told Darius one evening as they cleaned brushes. "Men like Hale don't change without enemies pushing back." Darius wiped his hands, leaving streaks of white paint across his palms. "Then maybe we push harder. At Hale Tower." Richard was doing exactly that. He summoned the company's public relations chief, Lydia Tran, to his office. "I need a press conference," he said. "We're announcing a community trust for redevelopment. Funds will come directly from Hale Industries profits." Lydia blinked. "Sir, that's unprecedented." "So is a conscience in this building," he replied dryly. She hesitated. "The board will revolt." "Let them." She studied him for a moment. "You're changing, Richard." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just remembering who I was supposed to be." 2 nights later, the press conference was broadcast live. Cameras flashed as Richard stood behind a podium emblazoned with the Hale logo. Behind him hung a large photograph of the community center, rebuilt walls, children playing, laughter frozen in time. "My name has stood for progress," he began, voice steady. "But progress without compassion isn't progress, it's destruction with a better brand name." He paused, meeting the cameras head-on. "Starting today, Hale Industries will dedicate 20% of its annual profit to rebuild the communities we displaced. Carterville will be the first." Applause erupted, but not everyone was clapping. In the front row, Douglas Reed leaned toward a reporter, whispering something that made her eyebrows rise. Within hours, online headlines spun in 2 directions: Hale's humanity restores hope, and stockholders panic at reckless CEO's pledge. By midnight, Richard's office phone rang. It was Reed. "Congratulations," he said coldly. "You've become a hero to people who'll never buy your condos." "Better than being a villain to those who can't afford to live in them," Richard answered. Reed's tone sharpened. "You're finished, Richard. The board's meeting tomorrow to vote you out." Richard looked at the rain streaking down the window. "If that's the cost of doing the right thing, I'll pay it." Meanwhile, in Carterville, the battle played out differently. The next morning, Darius found the front doors of the center chained shut. A bright red notice hung across them: property under review, access restricted by Hale Industries legal department. The volunteers gathered in disbelief. Ms. Garrett muttered, "They can't just take it back." Darius's stomach sank. "Yes, they can. It's still theirs on paper." Elaine placed a hand on his shoulder. "So what now?" He took a breath, then smiled. "We do what they don't expect. We open the doors anyway." With a bolt cutter borrowed from the auto shop, Darius snapped the chain in one strike. The crowd cheered, pushing the doors open, flooding the center with life again. Kids ran in, laughing, the echo of their joy louder than any threat. News cameras arrived minutes later. When asked why he'd broken the lock, Darius answered simply, "You can't chain kindness." That line went viral before sunset. At Hale Tower, Reed watched the footage in rage. "He's using that boy against us," he snarled to his assistant. But Richard, watching the same clip, smiled quietly. "No," he said under his breath. "That boy's teaching us." He turned from the screen to his reflection in the glass. The city spread below him, shining and fractured. "Principles don't make you rich," he murmured, "but they make you worth something." That night, a storm swept through Carterville, rattling the windows of the center. Yet inside, people stayed, reading, singing, fixing. The walls trembled, but the spirit held. And somewhere between thunderclaps and flickering light, Darius whispered to his mother, "He's fighting for us now." Elaine smiled faintly. "Then maybe this time, baby, we might just win." Outside, lightning tore across the sky like a vow written in fire. The lines were drawn clear now, profit on one side, principle on the other, and the boy who started it all stood ready to defend the hope he'd built with nothing more than $4.32. Since the night before the board vote, the city was draped in cold rain. Sheets of water lashed against the glass walls of Hale Tower, each droplet like a reminder that storms come for everyone, rich or poor. Inside his corner office, Richard Hale stood before the window, sleeves rolled up, tie discarded, staring at the lights of Carterville in the distance. That little town was invisible to most from this height, swallowed by the urban sprawl. But in Richard's mind, it burned brighter than any skyline. On his desk lay 2 letters. One was typed on Hale Industries letterhead, drafted by Douglas Reed, a motion for his removal as CEO, citing emotional instability and fiduciary negligence. The other was handwritten, creased from being read too many times. A boy gave us his last $4. He picked up the letter from his father, reading it again, his voice a low whisper against the rain. You said there are still good people left, Dad. Let's see if one can survive a boardroom. At dawn, Carterville woke to a very different sound, the low rumble of trucks approaching. Darius ran outside barefoot, heart pounding. The Hale Industries logo gleamed on the sides of the vehicles. But instead of wrecking crews, they were loaded with construction materials, cement, lumber, paint, roofing tiles. A man stepped out holding a clipboard. Delivery for the Morrison Community Center, he said. Darius blinked in disbelief. Who sent this? The man smiled. Richard Hale. Said you'd know what to do. Neighbors poured into the street, cheering. Elaine hugged her son, tears streaming down her cheeks. He's fighting for us, baby. Then we fight with him, Darius said, determination burning in his voice. They worked all morning, rebuilding faster than the rain could fall. But in the shadows, a black car waited across the street. Inside, Douglas Reed watched through the windshield, jaw tight. Let him have his last good deed, he muttered. By tomorrow, he'll have nothing left to give. By 9 a.m., the boardroom at Hale Industries was filled. The air hummed with tension. Reporters lingered in the lobby, smelling blood. Reed sat at the head of the table this time, his expression one of smug composure. Shall we begin? He said, tapping his pen. The agenda is simple, a vote to remove Richard Hale as CEO, effective immediately. Richard entered the room quietly, rainwater still clinging to his coat. He placed a folder on the table and looked around at the faces he'd once trusted, men and women who had built empires beside him but had forgotten why they started. Before you vote, he said calmly, I have something to show you. He pressed a button on the remote. The screens lining the boardroom walls flickered to life. First came footage of Carterville, the crumbling homes, the boarded windows, the empty parks. Then, slowly, new images replaced them, volunteers painting, children laughing, the old community center alive again. And in the center of it all stood Darius Williams, holding a paintbrush like a banner. This is what we left behind, Richard said. And this is what one boy built with nothing but kindness. Reed scoffed. Emotional propaganda. No, Richard said. Reality. He walked to the center of the room, his tone deepening. We've built towers, but we've forgotten people. We measure success by balance sheets while neighborhoods drown in the debts we created. That stops today. Reed leaned forward. You're a businessman, Richard, not a priest. I'm a human being, Richard replied. And so are the millions who live under the shadow of our logo. The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the older board members, Marjorie Lang, cleared her throat. What exactly are you proposing? A community trust, Richard said, sliding the folder forward. Hale Industries will reinvest a portion of profits into the neighborhoods we've displaced. Education, housing, healthcare, real change, not marketing campaigns. Reed laughed harshly. You'll destroy our profit margins. I'll restore our humanity, Richard said. Marjorie studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I vote yes. Reed's jaw tightened. Noted. Anyone else? One by one, Hesitant hands rose. 2. 4. 6. The count climbed until the final vote tipped the scale. 7-5, in Richard's favor. Reed's smile vanished. You can't be serious. Richard exhaled, his voice calm. I'm entirely serious. Reed shot to his feet. You've just killed this company. No, Richard said, gathering his papers. I've just saved its soul. The news hit within hours. Hale Industries commits to historic community reinvestment plan. Stock prices wavered, then steadied as reporters framed it as visionary. But in Carterville, nobody cared about the markets, they only cared that someone finally listened. By afternoon, Richard arrived at the Morrison Center. The crowd erupted in cheers as he stepped from his car, rain-soaked and smiling for the first time in years. Darius ran forward. You did it. Richard laughed. We did it. They walked inside together. The once ruined hall now gleamed with fresh paint and new lights. A mural covered one wall, a boy handing a coin to an old man. Above it, in bright letters, it read, Hope costs $4.32. Frank Morrison stood nearby, eyes glistening. I guess I lived long enough to see the world turn right side up again, he said softly. Elaine hugged her son tightly. This is what your kindness built, she whispered. That evening, Richard and Darius sat outside the center, watching the sun break through the last of the rain clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and paint. Children played in the yard, their laughter carrying across the street like music. Darius looked at Richard. Do you think it'll last? Richard considered the question carefully. Good things don't last on their own, he said. They last because people fight for them. Because people like you keep reminding the world what matters. Darius smiled. Guess we'll both have to keep fighting then. Richard chuckled. I'm counting on it. For a long time, they sat in silence, two men from opposite worlds, one built by privilege, the other by struggle, united by the same truth, that compassion, once awakened, can't be buried again. Miles away, in a quiet office, Douglas Reed stared at the final news report. His reflection glimmered against the TV screen, anger mixed with envy. You won this round, he muttered. But even light casts shadows. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope addressed to the State Zoning Board. Inside was a formal complaint alleging illegal development practices at the Carterville site. His lips curved into a cold smile. Let's see how long your miracle lasts. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant but approaching. But in Carterville, the storm no longer scared anyone. The lights stayed on in the community center late into the night, laughter echoing from its windows, warmth glowing from its walls. And at the heart of it all sat a 15-year-old boy, writing in a worn notebook, his handwriting uneven but sure. Sometimes kindness doesn't fix everything, he wrote. But it makes people believe it can be fixed, and that's enough to start. He looked up, smiling at the sound of the rain easing outside, the same rain that had once felt heavy with despair now washing the streets clean. The reckoning had come, not just for a company, but for everyone who had forgotten what humanity looked like. And this time, kindness had won the first battle. Morning light spilled through the windows of the newly restored Morrison Community Center, bathing the old brick walls in gold. It was the first truly quiet dawn Carterville had known in years. No demolition trucks, no corporate security patrols, no fear hanging in the air. The smell of fresh paint and damp earth filled the hall, mingling with the sweet aroma of coffee brewing in paper cups. Outside, neighbors gathered like they were attending a festival. Children in bright clothes chased one another through puddles left by the night's rain, their laughter rolling down Oak Street like the sound of wind chimes. Vendors set up tables selling pies, fruit, and handmade crafts. Someone hung a banner across the entrance that read in bold red letters, "Welcome back, Carterville." Darius Williams stood on the front steps, the morning sun warming his face. His hands were stained with paint and glue, but he didn't care. Around him, life had returned, colorful, messy, and real. His mother, Elaine, stood nearby, wearing her cleanest dress, pride shining through her tired smile. "You see this?" she whispered. "You did this, baby." Darius shook his head. "We did." From across the street, the familiar black town car appeared once more. This time, though, it wasn't met with suspicion. People waved. Some even clapped as it slowed to a stop. When Richard Hale stepped out, dressed simply in rolled sleeves and no tie, the applause grew louder. For the first time, the man who once symbolized everything wrong about Carterville's suffering now stood as a guest in the world he had nearly erased. Richard climbed the steps to where Darius stood. "You've built something beautiful here," he said quietly. "We just gave the people a reason to believe again," Darius replied. "They did the rest." Richard smiled faintly. "Belief is the hardest thing to build." He looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, old and young, black and white, rich and poor, all gathered in one place. The air shimmered with something rare and fragile, unity. Inside, the ceremony began. The hall was packed, teachers, construction workers, students, churchgoers, families displaced years ago returning with tears in their eyes. Frank and Evelyn Morrison sat in the front row, holding hands. A choir from the local church hummed softly as the mayor, a stern-faced woman named Linda Carver, took the stage. "This town has seen hard days," she began, voice echoing through the hall. "We've lost homes, jobs, and hope. But what you see here is what happens when courage and compassion meet in the middle." She gestured toward Darius and Richard. Two people who had every reason to live in separate worlds decided to build one together. "And that," she said, pausing for effect, "is the story Carterville will tell for generations." Applause thundered through the room. Darius felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to attention, he still saw himself as the kid counting coins at the corner market, but now those same coins had somehow turned into foundations and futures. When the applause faded, Richard stepped forward. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I spent years thinking leadership meant control," he said. "That success meant profit. But a boy taught me otherwise." He looked toward Darius. "He taught me that strength isn't measured in what you own, it's measured in what you're willing to give." The crowd erupted again. Elaine wiped her eyes, and even Reed's former allies, sitting stiffly in the back, looked uncomfortable under the weight of conscience. After the ceremony, Richard walked through the center with Darius and Elaine. The new rooms buzzed with life, a reading space, a small clinic, and a workshop where local teens repaired donated bikes. On one wall, the mural stood finished now, the boy and the coin, surrounded by bright swirls of community faces and hands joining across color and class. Above it, in gold lettering, the words read, "Hope costs $4.32. Richard." Stopped in front of it, his eyes misting. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "if everyone gave even a fraction of what you gave that night, time, kindness, courage, the world would look a lot different." Elaine smiled. "Maybe it's starting to." Just then, a commotion rose outside. Reporters were shouting, cameras flashing. Darius ran to the window, and froze. A convoy of city officials had arrived, carrying new blueprints stamped with the Carterville redevelopment plan. For once, they weren't here to tear something down, they were here to expand. Mayor Carver entered, waving the plans high. "We've secured state funding to restore the entire East District," she announced. Hale Industries Community Trust made it possible. This is only the beginning. The building shook with cheers. Strangers hugged. Someone began to sing. As the day stretched on, sunlight broke through the clouds completely, bathing the town in warmth. Children rode their repaired bicycles through the streets, streamers trailing behind them. Food trucks lined the park, music poured from open windows, and the smell of fried chicken and barbecue drifted through the air. Darius stood at the edge of it all, watching people dance in the streets where silence used to live. Beside him, Richard leaned on the railing, hands in his pockets. "You've turned this place into something extraordinary," he said. Darius laughed softly. "Funny thing is, it started with noodles and an old couple's medicine." Richard smiled. "That's how all revolutions start, quietly." He reached into his pocket and handed Darius a small velvet box. "This isn't a reward," he said. "It's a promise." Inside lay a silver coin engraved with the words, "One act of kindness." On the back was the Hale Industries emblem, newly redesigned, no longer a tower, but two hands clasped together. "What's it for?" Darius asked. Richard looked at the horizon, where the skyline met the rebuilt rooftops of Carterville. "For you to keep until someone else needs it more." Darius nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken lesson. Evening fell. Lanterns hung from strings, glowing like fireflies above the crowd. The choir returned, their voices rising into the warm air, a song of renewal, of grace reclaimed. Elaine danced with Lila, laughing freely for the first time in years. Frank and Evelyn sat side by side, watching their town reborn. Richard stepped back into the shadows for a moment, unnoticed, content to watch. For once, he didn't need to be seen. He had given up control and found peace in return. Beside him, Darius joined him quietly. "You're not leaving, are you?" Richard smiled faintly. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a while. I think this town still has lessons left for me." They stood together under the lantern light, the air humming with music, laughter, and promise. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Darius sat on the steps of the community center, holding the silver coin in his palm. The moon reflected off its surface, turning it into a tiny mirror. He could see his own reflection there, older somehow, not in years but in understanding. His mother joined him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You think it'll stay this way?" He looked out at the streets, glowing with life. "Hope doesn't stay," he said softly. "It's something you keep building." Elaine smiled. "Then keep building, my boy." The sound of laughter drifted through the night, mingling with the hum of crickets and the rustle of wind in the trees. The once-forgotten town breathed again, alive with light and music. And as Darius tucked the coin safely into his pocket, a single truth settled in his heart: kindness may not change the whole world in a day, but on this day, it had changed his world completely. The day hope returned, Carterville learned that compassion could be stronger than money, louder than power, and more lasting than any storm. And for the first time, it felt like morning might last forever. Dawn returned to Carterville in shades of gold and silver, spreading across the rooftops like a blessing. The new paint on the Morrison Community Center gleamed faintly in the early light, and the mural on its front wall, hope costs $4.32, seemed to glow on its own. The town was quiet now, the kind of quiet that follows triumph, peaceful, steady, and full. Inside the center, Darius Williams moved through the hall with a broom in hand, sweeping confetti and paper cups from the floor. The echoes of last night's celebration still clung to the air, music, laughter, the hum of people remembering what it felt like to belong. His mother, Elaine, dozed in a chair nearby, a shawl over her shoulders, her face relaxed for the first time in years. Darius smiled softly. "You can rest now, Mom," he whispered. "You did enough." The door creaked open behind him. A familiar voice filled the room. "You know, most people your age would have slept till noon after a night like that." Darius turned, grinning. Richard Hale stood in the doorway, dressed simply in jeans and a coat, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. "Couldn't sleep," Darius said. "Feels weird when everything's good." Richard chuckled. "You'll get used to it, though I still haven't." He looked around the hall, his gaze settling on the mural. "Every time I see that wall, I remember what $4 can buy when it's given by the right hands." Darius leaned on his broom. "You rebuilt this place, Mr. Hale." "Not me." "No," Richard said softly. "You rebuilt me." For a moment, they both stood silent, the sunlight spilling through the windows between them. Then Richard gestured toward the street. "Come on. There's something I want to show you." They walked through Carterville as the town awakened. Bakery doors opened, sending warm smells into the air. A mechanic waved from under the hood of a pickup truck. The same people who once hid from the world now walked with purpose. At the corner of Oak and 9th, they stopped before a fenced lot. A new sign stood in the dirt, future site of the Darius Williams Youth Academy, sponsored by the Hale Community Trust. Darius blinked, stunned. "This is me." Richard nodded, smiling. "You started something that deserves to last. This academy will train kids from every background, mechanics, artists, builders, dreamers. No tuition, no barriers." Darius shook his head slowly. "You didn't have to do this." Richard's gaze softened. "No, I had to. Because the measure of a man isn't how much he earns, but what he builds that outlives him. You taught me that." Darius stared at the sign for a long moment, his chest tight. "It's going to change everything," he whispered. "That's the point," Richard said. Later that morning, they returned to the community center where the townspeople had gathered again, this time not for speeches or ceremonies, but for work. Hammers rang. Voices sang. Kids carried brushes and planted flowers along the walkway. Elaine joined them, smiling at the sight of Richard carrying wood alongside the teenagers. "Didn't think I'd see the day," she teased. Richard wiped sweat from his forehead, laughing. "I'll admit, manual labor isn't in my job description." "Then maybe you're finally doing something real," she said, half joking, half true. He nodded. "I'd like to think so." They worked through the morning, the rhythm of construction blending with laughter. The walls of the academy began to rise, a framework of hope built on hands once divided by power. By afternoon, a light breeze swept through town. Reporters had come again, not to expose scandal but to witness rebirth. One of them, a young journalist named Sabrina Cross, approached Darius with a camera. "How does it feel," she asked, "to know you started a movement?" Darius thought for a moment before answering. "It doesn't feel like a movement. It feels like family. Like we finally remembered what we owe each other." Her eyes softened. And what do you think people can learn from you? He smiled faintly. That kindness isn't weakness. It's power that doesn't need permission. The line spread quickly online, shared, quoted, and painted onto murals in nearby cities. But in Carterville, it was just another truth spoken by a boy who had never expected to be heard. As the day wore on, the sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of copper. Richard stood by his car, watching the town he'd once nearly destroyed come alive again. Darius joined him quietly. "You heading back to the city?" the boy asked. "For a bit," Richard said. "But not forever. I'll be checking in often." He paused, then reached into his coat pocket and handed Darius a worn leather notebook. "My father kept this. It's full of ideas he never had the chance to finish. Maybe you can." Darius opened it, eyes wide. Inside were sketches, notes, and hand-drawn blueprints for community programs, dreams that had never made it past paper. He really wanted to help people, he murmured. Richard nodded. He lost his way. So did I. But maybe this is how we find it again, through you. Darius smiled. Then we'll finish what he started. They shook hands, firm, equal, unspoken understanding passing between them. Evening settled over Carterville, painting long shadows across the streets. The town's new lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the murals and storefronts. The choir from the church gathered in the square, their voices rising into the cooling air. Elaine stood beside her son as the song echoed through the town, her eyes reflecting the light. "Your father would be proud of you," she said softly. Darius's throat tightened. "You think so?" She smiled. "He always said the world doesn't change when rich men decide to. It changes when good people refuse to give up." He looked up at the sky, stars beginning to emerge, and whispered, "Then I'll never stop." Meanwhile, miles away in the city, Richard Hale returned to his office, not to the sterile tower that once defined him, but to a smaller building near the river. The nameplate on the door read, Hale and Williams Foundation for Human Potential. He placed a framed photograph on his desk, one of the mural from the Morrison Center, the boy and the coin. For a long time, he simply stared at it, the faintest smile crossing his face. When Clara, his longtime assistant, entered, she stopped in surprise. "Sir, are you really moving the headquarters here?" Richard nodded. "This is where the future begins. Not in towers. In towns." Back in Carterville, the night air carried the sound of laughter, footsteps, and soft jazz drifting from an open window. Darius sat on the steps of the academy in progress, flipping through the old notebook, sketching new plans beside his father's faded ink. He glanced up at the mural, its gold letters glowing under the streetlight. Hope costs $4.32. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the silver coin Richard had given him. He turned it between his fingers, thinking of the day he'd met the Morrisons, the night he'd gone to bed hungry but content, the morning the black town car arrived, the storm, the fight, the redemption. So much had changed, but what mattered had not. He whispered to himself, kindness doesn't fade. It multiplies. The sound of a passing train echoed in the distance, long and low. The world moved on, but Carterville, for once, was moving with it, not beneath it. Darius smiled, placing the coin back in his pocket. Above him, the first stars shimmered like silver promises in the dark. And somewhere between them and the earth below, one truth hung eternal. That the true measure of a man is not the empire he builds, but the hearts he rebuilds when he finally remembers how to care.